Good evening. Buenas noches. Buenas tardes. Something like that. I'm Scott Thomas. I'm the Dean of the School of Educational Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce the third annual World Cultures in Education lecture. I want to start by thanking Professor John Regan, whose generosity has made this possible. Professor Regan was an institution at CGU, is an institution at CGU, and had interests that run directly along the lines of the conversation that we'll have tonight with this panel. This is one lecture in a series within the School of Educational Studies. Next up, we have the Casanova lecture with Christopher Oberg, and later in April, we'll have a panel on community-engaged schools with another group of experts from around the country. But tonight, we're going to focus on world cultures in education. And with that said, it's my honor to introduce Professor Tom Lushai, who will be running tonight's panel and discussion. And he will introduce our participants and set the groundwork for the remainder of the evening. And welcome, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. I really do want to thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening. I recognize a lot of you from my classes, so all of that advertising worked. Thanks for coming. I want to thank, in particular, Professor John Regan, who's not here, but whose generosity has supported these World Cultures and Education lectures. This is our third now. Last year, I also had the opportunity to moderate a moderated discussion between Professor Carlos Torres from UCLA and Dr. Shun Kanaiaupuni from Kamehameha Schools in Hawaii. That was a fascinating talk, and I think we saw some themes that I think we may see again this evening. The talk for this evening, the theme is educational innovations and lessons from the global South. So why is this an important topic, and why are we here talking about this, and what is the rationale? So I'm going to provide a brief rationale and a brief motivation for the speakers that are going to follow. In 2011, the Qatar Foundation established the World Innovation Summit for Education Prize, or the WISE Prize. With this prize, the foundation hoped to recognize an outstanding educational actor or organization with demonstrated achievements that have had a lasting impact upon education at any level through inspiring and visionary approaches. This recognition would enhance the status of education by giving it similar prestige to other areas for which international prizes like the Nobel Prize already exist, such as literature, peace, and economics. The inaugural winner in 2011 of the WISE Prize was the Bangladesh Rural Action Committee, or BRAC, the world's largest non-governmental organization. BRAC has provided schooling opportunities for millions of impoverished children in Bangladesh and has expanded its reach across 3 continents. In 2012, the WISE Prize went to India's Pratham, which Amita will be talking a little bit about this evening, which has worked to improve access to and quality of schooling in India, Pakistan, and sub-Saharan Africa. The 2013 winner of the WISE Prize, Colombia's Escuela Nueva, which began its work in remote rural schools amidst civil conflict, has been adopted in 16 other countries and has reached an estimated 5 million children worldwide. This past November, the 4th WISE Prize went to the Campaign for Female Education, or CAMFED, an organization that promotes girls' education in sub-Saharan Africa. In the past 2 decades, CAMFED has reached more than 3 million girls in Ghana, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Now, a brief poll of this sophisticated audience. How many of you have heard of the WISE Prize? Not bad. Not bad, but as I said, this is a sophisticated audience. But I have the feeling that if we were in another educational venue, we wouldn't have seen so many hands up. But I want to express my pride in my daughter who raised her hand back there, Linda Lushai, everyone. Thank you very much. So Linda's actually good friends with one of the WISE Prize winners. So the problem of our lack of knowledge of innovations like those honored by the WISE Prize And the WISE Prize itself makes us wonder, what else are we missing? What else have we overlooked? What other inspiring and visionary approaches or policies have we missed from the developing world? Well, this problem was on the mind of Pratham's Dr. Madhav Chavan when he accepted the WISE Prize in 2012. Dr. Chavan called for his audience to turn their attention toward education in the South and East, where the world exists. The objective of this year's World Cultures and Education lecture is to heed Dr. Chavan's advice by highlighting educational innovations and successes from the South and East that can inform educational reform efforts in the United States. To achieve this objective, we've invited 3 outstanding speakers with considerable educational research experience in South Asia, East Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And the guiding questions we've posed to these speakers are the following. 1, what important educational examples or innovations from your region do you think that United States education policymakers and practitioners should know about? And 2, what are the lessons that the United States should take from these examples and innovations? So without further delay, I want to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to ask each of them to come up here and talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So directly to my left, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Claremont and to introduce Dr. Amita Chudgar. Thank you. Amita is currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University and is an associate professor at Michigan State University. Amita is an economist of education, and her long-term interests focus on ensuring that children and adults in resource-constrained environments have equal access to high-quality learning opportunities, irrespective of their backgrounds. Her work examines the influence of home, school, and community contexts on educational access and achievement of children in resource-constrained environments through the analysis of diverse, large-scale, national in India, regional in South Asia and Francophone Africa, and cross-national data sets. She explores the role of policy-relevant variables in ensuring equal educational opportunities for disadvantaged children. As nations struggle to provide these opportunities to more children with fewer resources, the pursuit of educational equity and quality compete with demands for greater efficiency. Amita's recent research has actively engaged with and responded to the inherent tensions among equity, quality, and efficiency. By examining the growth in alternative forms of education provision, like increasing reliance on various forms of private schooling and contract-based teaching, and their implications. Her long-term interests as a scholar focus on ensuring that children and adults in resource-constrained environments have equal access to high-quality learning opportunities, irrespective of their backgrounds. Once again, help me to welcome Amita. To Amita's left, it also gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our esteemed alumni. I never know how to pronounce that word, the plural of the female noun okay. Dr. Nancy Pine, Professor Emerita at Mount St. Mary's University. Nancy has taught American elementary students, teachers of elementary students, and over all that time accumulated a 25-year history of cross-cultural research with her counterparts in China. In the process, she has learned one basic fundamental truth. We both want what the other has. Americans want more studious, focused students who are also good at math. The Chinese want innovative students who can create imaginative ideas. Nancy's recent book, Educating Young Giants, What Kids Learn and Don't Learn in China and America, delves into the heart of these desires and differences. At Mount St. Mary's University in the heart of Los Angeles, Nancy directed the elementary education program for 10 years and founded and directed the Bridging Cultures U.S.-China program. Before, she taught in public elementary and high schools for 14 years and coordinated an innovative educational research project at CGU that drew national recognition. She has published academically in education and cross-cultural research, given talks and led workshops nationally and internationally, and won numerous awards, including a City of Los Angeles Award for her cross-cultural expertise. She is a Huffington Post blogger and also has written about her insights in popular articles and in essays in China Images. Please help me welcome Dr. Nancy Pine. And to her left, the School of Educational Studies' newest faculty member, Dr. Lucrecia Santibanez, an associate professor here in the School of Educational Studies of Teaching, Learning, and Culture. Previously, Lucrecia was an education economist at the Rand Corporation. She has studied how to increase education quality and access of opportunity to low-income populations in the United States and abroad. Her research focuses on school-based management, parent engagement, school leadership, and teacher labor markets. She is currently developing a new research agenda focusing on English language learners. Her academic research has been published by Economics of Education Review, Teachers College Record, Review of Educational Research, Wellbeing and Social Policy, and La Revista Mexicana de Investigación Educativa. As principal investigator or co-principal investigator, she has received research grants from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Besides the United States, she has expertise studying education systems in Mexico, El Salvador, Peru, Colombia, Laos, Cambodia, and Mozambique. Please help me once again to welcome Lucrecia. And by the way, this lecture isn't just about me inviting my graduate school buddies to come talk at CGU. And in fact, I was a little hesitant because I was worried that people would perceive a Stanford bias here. So I thought, okay, well, Nancy is an alumna from CGU. Lo and behold, she has her master's degree from Stanford. So I've talked a lot now, so I want to cede the floor to our esteemed guest presenters. So I am going to ask Amita to come and talk about South Asia.
Okay, wait. All right. So thank you all for being here. You know, like Tom mentioned on a Thursday evening, like Scott mentioned, this is sort of, I mean, there's just so much going on around the campus. It's wonderful to have all of you and to be able to share some of these ideas. I want to thank CGU, Scott, the school, for inviting me. And it's a real honor for me to be on this wonderful panel with Nancy and Lucrecia. And I want to get done talking quickly so I can listen to what they have to say, because I really want to hear their thoughts and their ideas. But I really especially want to thank my very dear friend and colleague, Tom, I mean, not just for inviting me, for a very generous introduction, but I want to thank Tom for doing something that I think we all need to do more of. You know, Tom gave me this charge to think about what might we learn from the South, right? I grew up in India. I work in developing countries. That's sort of where my research focuses. And when you work in developing countries, you usually work from a notion of deficit, right? From the notion of what is wrong, what is missing, what is inadequate, what is not enough, you know, the poverty, the deprivation, the challenges. Very rarely do you think about these issues and you think about the positive. What might I get from this which might actually be, might be seen in a positive light and which might actually be informative for other contexts. And Tom prompted me to think about it like this, and for which I'm very grateful. And I want to thank Tom and that, as a friend and as a colleague for pushing me in this direction. And I know that Tom's own work hopes to continue focusing and taking this thread forward in terms of how we might think about this knowledge transfer or this information transfer. Typically it happens from the north to the south, right? Or from the west to the east. But how might we think about this transfer also happening in the other direction? And that is the charge that I think he wants to take forward. And I'm excited to continue working with him and seeing where he and his work takes us in this regard. So my charge was to speak about South Asia. And I'm by no means an expert on South Asia. Just being born someplace does not make you an expert, right? But I do a lot of work in South Asia. And so what I decided to do was to tell you just a little bit about South Asia. And then I tried to think of sort of like, 3 lessons that stood out to me as I was thinking about this and share those with you. So very briefly, when you think about South Asia, we typically think of these 8 countries, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. These 8 countries is considered the South Asia region. So clearly you can see this is a big region in the world, right? I mean, in terms of population, this is around 1.6 billion people. So it's 5 times the population of the United States. This is a lot of people we are talking about sort of in one fell swoop. And so clearly there is a huge amount of diversity here and a range of socioeconomic sort of variation that one can only imagine. In terms of economic status overall, this is a fairly poor region of the world, right? So overall economic well-being is around 1/10 the well-being of North America, of United States. So we are talking about a fairly large section of the world, which is also relatively poor ultimately when it comes down to resources. So it is within this context, I want to share with you some observations and some examples of colleagues, of partners, of scholars I know who are working here, and draw maybe some lessons that might have broader application beyond South Asia. And as I do this, in my talk, I'm going to have a bit of a bias towards India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, because that's just where I'm drawing the examples from. But it's not to say that there is not good work happening in other countries. It's just that that's sort of the limitation of my knowledge currently, or sort of where some of my information currently is drawn from. So as I was thinking about, what are the lessons one can draw, the first thing that struck me as I thought about my colleagues and my friends and partners in South Asia working on educational challenges that stood out to me was this, it was their willingness to work on tremendous scales, right? The problems that we are thinking about are really, in some sense, intractable, huge educational challenges. And the colleagues and the friends that I know in South Asia working on these issues are really willing to work comprehensively, willing to work at scale. They take a long-term view of the problem, right? Nobody is in there for the short haul. Nobody is in there for a summer project. Nobody is in there for a year. These are their careers. They've devoted their lives to thinking about these issues. And I think that deep commitment seems to me a key for any educational setting where the problems have been deep-seated and been present for a very, very long time, right? And so this willingness to work with a long-run view and at scale is something that I think stood out to me as maybe the first lesson that we might draw out. And to make a point, so to give you an example, let me share with you this fascinating story from Pratham, the NGO that Tom talked about, and some of the work they did, which kind of drives home this idea of working at scale. So what was happening in India? So Pratham started in Mumbai, the city that I grew up in. That's my hometown. It's a big mega city. And they've been working with education, school children in India and Indian villages for a very long time. At the beginning of the 21st century, around early 2000, all over the world this was happening. More and more children were enrolling in school, but we really didn't know if they were learning anything in their schools, right? And so this was a problem that there was sort of, it's a huge problem. How do you find out how much all of the millions of Indian children are learning inside their schools? So Pratham began to think about this issue as well. And what they had done in their work, because they were already working on education in India, is that they developed these really simple testing instruments, these survey instruments. What I pulled out here are examples of the entire survey instrument. The top one is a language survey in Hindi language, which is the national language of the country. And the bottom one is the math survey in Gujarati language, one of the other languages in the country. And so really, this is like a 4-question survey. Can you recognize a letter? Yes, no. Okay. Can you read a word? Yes, no. If you can read a word, can you read a sentence? Yes, no. If you can do that, can you read the whole story? Just really, really simple, right? So Pratham had already developed these tools for their work in India. So they made sure that these tools were available in like 17 or many Indian languages, because India has so many, we have I think 17 plus official languages, right? So they made sure the tools were available, this very simple tool in these languages. And then what they did is even more amazing and fascinating. What they did is essentially they recruited young, people like this woman, young people from all over the country. They recruited over 30,000 volunteers, just people, who were doing this not with any remuneration or anything like that, to go to each villages in India and gather information on just simply offer this survey to children in Indian villages to see if they were learning. And over time, what has happened is that more than 2,000 organizations across the country have partnered with this mega NGO at one level or another. And this is the working at scale, right? Working at sort of this huge, massive scale. And what this has resulted in the last 10 years is that Pratham, this survey arm is called Asar, which also in Hindi or in Urdu means impact. They have been able to produce, since 2005, every year a survey of what Indian children are learning in schools for the entire country, for the rural population. I mean, this is phenomenal. Every year, to give you a sense of the scale, the survey covers around 700,000 children with 30,000 volunteers and 15,000. I mean, these are just huge numbers, right? And right now, I mean, you perhaps won't believe that this is the only systematic source of information that we have if you want to find out what Indian children are learning in their schools. As basic and rudimentary as it is, I mean, this is an example of working at scale, right? So impressive. What is even more interesting and cool is that then this idea moved to Pakistan. And Pakistan in 2008 started doing their version of Asar. And so Pakistan is now doing something similar. Even more cool, this idea moved to countries in Africa. So there are 3 East African countries, and there is Mali and Senegal, who are now all doing their version of this volunteer-driven, very, very simple tool, spreading out across villages and just getting this basic data, which otherwise these countries don't have, right? And I mean, this is just fascinating and amazing when you think of the colleagues and partners who have been able to get this kind of thing to happen and move. This South-South partnership between countries in the South, so nobody from America or England is flying in and telling them how to do this, right? These are countries in the South partnering. It's reaching over 1.6 billion people. And this is huge in scale, right? I mean, this is, and so this is, to me, when I think about one of the lessons we could draw is this desire to take this long-term, we are here for good, right? Nobody's going away in one summer, and we're willing to work at scale, not looking for short, quick returns, and we're willing to take on really huge problems comprehensively. The second lesson that I might draw as I think about this is and again, this is a very obvious thing, but perhaps not so when you think about some of the things that you learn when you observe colleagues working in some of these, resource-constrained environments. In the United States, it's often not easy to talk about education and cost in the same sentence, or education and efficiency in the same sentence, right? Because we inherently believe that if you're careful about cost or efficiency, you are somehow shortchanging the children. Well, in many of these contexts, that's not even a choice. If you want to reach many children, you kind of have to think about sometimes, marrying efficiency with outcomes. You have to keep the focus on the child, but it's an interesting thing to see how, you come up with sort of these interesting, innovative solutions, workarounds that might not immediately seem evident, but seem to, yield very interesting results. So I'll give you 3 examples. The first one is something that you see happening in Bangladesh. BRAC is an NGO you heard from Tom about, which is one of the largest NGOs in the world. And Pratham is doing a version of this as well. So again, what is happening in many poor countries is there is a tremendous shortage of qualified teachers. Children have access to no qualified teachers at all. So what do you do in that setting? You can wait for the government pipeline to catch up and the teachers to train and whatnot. But in the meantime, what these groups are doing is that they're working with women in the community. They're giving them some basic training so that they can go teach the children within the community. And these women then teach sometimes in non-formal, sometimes in semi-formal, and sometimes in formal setting and educate their children, right? So this is an interesting example of sort of this, a solution or a fix where this is not ideal. Obviously, you want your child to be studying with a trained teacher, but maybe if these women did not teach these children, the children might have no teaching at all, right? So this is sort of an interesting solution to this problem. Another interesting, I love this example, and I've talked to Tom and Tom's family about this too, and we all think this is such an interesting, cool idea. So this is an example from Bangladesh, where the school goes to the child. In Bangladesh, which has to put up with flooding, and now with global warming, things getting even worse. For many children, once the rain falls and there is flooding, that means end of going to school, right? And end of education, end of being able to consistently stay in school. So this one NGO came up with this really nice sort of an idea, which is a school boat. So the boat first works as a school bus, and it sort of goes around and gathers children as a boat, and picks all these kids up, and then it docks one place, and then it teaches them, and then it drops them off and does it again and does it again. And so in a day they have 3 sessions. And I think they also have solar panels, so they can even teach at night the children who have to work during the day, right? Because they need to work. And so as a result, you have this really interesting learning situation. Look at these. Yeah, this is not the ideal schoolhouse that you want for your child, but if this was the only option, if without this there was no education, this is pretty interesting, right? And so now this boat, they I think have served like some 90,000 people and some 50, 60 boats, and pretty cool, right? Another interesting innovative sort of solution that you see is around the low-cost use of technology. Shouldn't surprise us because technology does offer interesting solutions. So this is a very interesting project in India, which I was fortunate to be a part of. There's a professor in India, Brij Kothari. I got to work with him before I began graduate school. So in India, Bollywood is big, yeah? Dickie knows Bollywood is big. Elsewhere too. But this is like the film industry. There's the music, dance, all that. And people love it, And watching television, you see how people often watch television as a community. Like there is one television in the neighborhood and, like the 5 families get together and watch it. People love to sing along when the Bollywood songs are playing. So what the professor thought of doing was providing, you see that subtitle that kind of shows up in the same language. So you already know the words to the song, but now the subtitle is kind of just, floating underneath. And it's a subliminal sort of way of practicing learning, right, for these semi-literate or, kind of marginally literate adults. And it's a fascinating, very, very low-cost idea that has been gone to scale, right? Another similar use of low-cost technology is the use of mobile phones, which have been used quite widely. This is an intervention in Pakistan that UNESCO made. I'm aware of some work in Bangladesh. And these are very simple mobile phones, not like the fancy ones that you and I use. Very simple, rudimentary phones, but they are in the hands of these adults, and so they can be used as a way of transforming some information or some knowledge or some learning. So these are some examples that I guess one can also draw, which is to be able to, think about efficiency, think smartly, and sort of find flexible, nimble solutions, right, to these problems, which otherwise might have no straightforward mainstream solution to them. And then finally, as I was thinking about this, and I was sort of, to draw the sort of the final lesson or the final sort of observation, we think about big NGOs like Pratham or BRAC or these professors or, UNESCO and so forth working in education in these areas and making a difference. But I think what is equally important is the contribution that an average father or a mother or a son or a daughter or a child makes to making education a reality, right? And one might say that, there is something to this as well. Just this deep belief that education is a privilege, is a right, but it's also a privilege, right? And it is something to be cherished, something to be valued, protected, shared. And if a society, I think, has those kinds of beliefs and is willing to make personal sacrifices, I think that perhaps, is the ultimate sort of a sense of hope you might have for a society, no matter how deprived it might be today. So again, to share with you some information, some data, UN put up this nice little, you can actually go vote, even right now, this voting is on, where it asks people to vote, what is the world that you want post-2015, right? And you can see that the range of things you can choose from clean water, transportation, healthcare, job opportunity, education, political freedom, on and on and on, right? So people could go and vote. What is my top 6 priorities? My what are my 6 top priorities? Guess what? When you look at the data from South Asia, see more than 2 million votes, the top priority is a good education. Over a million, 1 point some, whatever, million votes, right? That's pretty cool, right? And this is across all age groups, both genders, all education levels. Education is voted as a top priority. And if you talk about South Asia, talk about the importance of education, I would be remiss if I didn't, we didn't mention Malala, right? This woman is from Pakistan, and essentially, she won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, and essentially, all she was doing was protecting her right and the right of children like her to simply receive an education. And that, that is the level of commitment where, just that, right? And the fight that you have to put up for something as simple as that which we take for granted in other parts of the world. And as I sort of tell you, Malala, all of you know of, I wanted to end with a story of another young man just like Malala that you perhaps don't know of, but as it turns out, Queen of London knows about him. There is no Queen of London as far as I know, but I just think this is a very funny little newspaper clipping that I just had to pull up. This is a young man called Babar Ali. He's an Indian man, Indian boy. He's, comes from a very poor family in rural India, and he was getting an education. It was challenging. He walked 10 kilometers every day, plus took some bus or train or something to get to school and back. So it was clearly not easy, but he was fortunate enough that in spite of the poverty and so forth, he was getting an education. So then when he would come home from school at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I think this is the thing that is so cool. He would play with his friends school. They would play this, right? And he noticed that so many of his friends had no opportunity. They had never seen the inside of a school. They quite enjoyed playing this game with him, and they were enjoying learning with him and sort of doing so forth. And so what does this boy do? He turns it into a real project, and he founds a school. And today, he's running this school in his parents' backyard, pretty much, which has now, like 800 children have gone through this school and has some 10 other grown-ups helping him out. But he is just another very interesting example of just this belief that education is something to be valued, cherished, and shared, right? That it's a right, but also a privilege that he wants to pass on and understands the value of. So those are then the 3 observations. Tom said lessons. I feel lessons is a very big word, but observations I'm more comfortable with, right? The willingness to work at scale, work comprehensively, take the long-run view. And these are very obvious things, but I think one can see the dedication in some of these colleagues in South Asia. I think it is important to be flexible, to be nimble, to be open to sort of different innovative ways of doing things. And then I think ultimately this deep belief in the value of education, right, as a right, but also as a privilege, as something that you protect, you cherish, you share, and I think those are some of the things that have stood out to me as I thought about the charge that Tom gave me. So thank you for listening, and this is really all I have to say.
Thank you, Amita. We're going to take a quick minute to change out our laptops, and next we will be hearing from Nancy Pine.
Well, good evening again. It really is a privilege to be here and to meet many of you whom we've already met, and also meet these 2 very distinguished panelists. I'm learning a tremendous amount already, and I agree that the whole concept of learning from others and not just thinking of this country as sort of the privileged place where we have a lot of answers is very important for a lot of reasons. One is that, of course, we don't have all the answers at all, and the other is that there are many things going on in other countries where we really can learn lessons from them. So I'm going to talk about China and the United States, and Tom asked me not only to talk about what we can learn from China, but what China can learn for us. So I'm going to talk very fast. So I'm going to first go over, without knocking that off, I'm going to go over the environment in both countries using a lot of pictures and just taking you through those 2 environments very quickly, and then I'll talk about the 2 things that we can learn from each other. So, but first, I stand here as one European-American woman, but I have a lot of colleagues in China who are sort of standing around me and listening to what I'm saying, and they have spent many years sharing their time, answering thousands of questions, sharing their classrooms and their homes with me, and there are plenty more. They come from both urban and rural areas, and I feel very privileged to have had them trust me and to have a lot of dialogues with them about many educational subjects. To begin with the Chinese schools, this is just to remind us that there are a lot of people in China. This is a high school, it's called an upper middle school in China. It's a high school in the middle of China in a rural area, and these are just the upperclassmen coming to an assembly. but there are plenty of other people in the background up against the building, and there are just thousands and thousands of students everywhere, which impacts education in a very different way than some of the issues that we deal with here. Because when you have so many people, you really are thinking about teaching and learning in a very different way. I have tried to pick out components from each country about the classrooms that actually are generalizable across most of the countries, but also recognizing, and it's very important to understand, that there are a lot of differences, not just here in how education is differentiated, but also in China. It's not as different in China as it is here, but from school to school to school and area to area, there are a lot of differences. So, but across all those schools, the students sit in rows. They stand to speak, and they don't get to sit down until the teacher tells them to. They stay in the same room all day, and the teachers come to them. So that's true first grade through high school. I'm not talking about kindergarten because in China, kindergarten is not part of the public school system. But the teacher, so a math teacher comes in for 45 minutes, teaches, leaves. Chinese teacher comes in and teaches, leaves, and goes off to another class, and so on throughout the day. And that's true in first grade, second grade, and all the way through high school. The teacher almost always stands at the front of the classroom and does a lot of the talking and asking students questions. However, the teachers, it's not just the teacher talking at the students. There's a dynamic in which the teacher asks questions, the students respond. Teacher, student, teacher, all the students, teacher, students. So it's very noisy, actually. But in fact, the teacher is controlling that lesson from beginning to end, and it's tied to the textbook. Writing in China requires enormous amount of focus and precision, and they learn it primarily for the first 3 grades. They start with simple characters which have up to about 15 strokes in it, and those strokes have to be in exactly the right place or you end up with a different character, and they have to be balanced within the square. So there's a lot of precision and focus on that. Very different from our 26 crummy letters that we learn in English. The Chinese, by the end of elementary school, they have to have 3,000 characters that they know. Students learn lessons in depth and detail, and for anyone who is educated in this country, detail that most of us wouldn't be able to tolerate, I think. They almost never ask questions, and they answer teachers' questions with responses memorized from the textbook. Memorization is a major part of learning in China, and very frustrating to both many students and also to their families. Their individual work is done at home, at night, on weekends, and during vacations, and when vacation comes, they're loaded up with homework, much to the frustration of many families who say, well, sometimes we help them do it. And then there's the Gaokao, which is a big exam, college entrance exam. It's taken shortly after they finish high school, and they spend basically all of senior high school, last 3 years of their education, preparing for that exam and memorizing all the textbooks, all the teachers' lectures, everything. And if you're headed for college, you really begin preparing for this in first grade. So memorization is often the exam actually just makes it more and more needed to memorize, and less and less possible to do other things. In the United States, the configuration of the schools is very different. A lot of classrooms sit in groups, and if they don't, they have very movable furniture that can be rearranged very quickly. In the classroom, they work individually, in pairs or groups, or in the whole class, and very often a teacher will work with one group and other things are going on in the classroom. So there's a lot of differentiation of what's going on in the classroom. The students in the United States tend to ask a lot of questions, and starting at a very early age. And the teachers and students move around this room, so compared to China, there's an enormous amount of movement. In fact, it's rather disconcerting to some of the Chinese educators who come here and see this movement and can't quite understand that underneath it are actually rules that are being followed. Lessons, very often students are encouraged to develop ideas, and the answers do not have to be perfect, whereas in China they really do need to be almost perfect. And there's a lot of encouragement to both learn from the outside world and also bring that world into the classroom and apply it to what's going on. So what can the US learn from Chinese schools? The two things I've selected, and I talked with some of you about this earlier today, are mathematics and also the organization of teachers, because the Teachers' Day, which is very different from here and could help us think about how to structure the Teachers' Day in the United States so our teachers have more time to actually plan together, to think about what they're doing, and to not just have a pretty lonely profession. So in mathematics, I think of two big pieces. There's a cultural component in which mathematics is embedded, and then there are the concepts of how to teach. So in China, just to give an example of numeric information is everywhere, and it's on a daily basis. So an example is this sign from, it's actually from the Forbidden City. There was an identical one in Chinese next to it. If you go down about 5 lines, the information there is expected by the public. So it talks about the size of the temple and the fact that it's 32.46 meters high, and then it's 11 bays wide, and those bays are 68.2 meters in length, etc. That's the kind of detailed information in numbers that is expected by the Chinese. When I told one of my Chinese friends that I tended to skip those sentences, and she couldn't believe it, and I'm sure she was appalled, although she was too polite to say it. Math is taught very differently, though. Students learn mathematical concepts from a very early age, and the teachers think very hard and long about how to do this well. So this is a rural second grade class. They had started with very small numbers like 5 plus 8, and then they moved very quickly. I mean, they already knew what 5 plus 8 was, but then they moved very quickly, learning that you could do it with 50 plus 80, 500 plus 800, 5,000 plus 8,000, that all of that was connected, and you could use that basic knowledge to move up the size of the numbers. And then they began doing it with more complex sets of numbers. And this is in second grade in a rural school. In a second grade in an urban school, and they have similar curriculums actually. In a rural school, in an urban school, they were learning about arrays, and so they spent the first 10 minutes going from sort of identifying where those animals were in the rows and columns, and then about 10 or 15 minutes later, they shifted to a numeric grid, and they were placing objects in it and finding them by number. So all they're missing is the X and the Y, and they've already gotten there in second grade. So that's just a very small example of how mathematics is taught, and what we could think about doing as far as teaching concepts rather than what we often teach is arithmetic in our schools, and not the big concepts. So the other thing is the Teachers' Day, and one of those things is connected to teaching math because they specialize in a subject. So there's a math teacher, a Chinese teacher, an art teacher, social science teacher, etc. So the teachers in elementary school often teach, there's a primary school math teacher and an upper elementary school math teacher. So they tend to because there are a lot of them, they talk to each other, they plan together, and they have the chance to dig deeply into how they're teaching and learn what the students are having trouble with and how to improve that. And they do that in great detail and very thoughtfully. The other thing is they only teach half a day. When I found this out, it took me a long time to understand this, and I just sort of said, so what do you do the rest of the day? And they actually, first, let's get through that. They spend time collaborating and planning. This is a teacher's office in a rather well-off southern China high school. But no matter what school I have been in, rural or urban, rich or sort of moderately not well-resourced, they're teachers' offices, and they get together and they plan and they correct papers and they write tests, and also a lot of the time they observe each other. So they go, these are 3 teachers in the back of a third grade math classroom, and they are taking notes on the lesson. Afterward, they actually ended up, and this is typical, they then get together with the teacher talks about what he or she planned to do, what was accomplished, what wasn't accomplished, some of the problems, and then together they make plans for better teaching of those concepts. And then they reform those lessons, and next time they teach them, they assess them again. The guy on the hat is from a village committee, so he is not a teacher, but he wanted to learn about how you teach math. So that's sort of, we can learn a lot from China about these things. What can China learn from us? I've selected 2 things. There are a lot of other things too, from both sides. But to relax and allow time to think, and also to ask questions and to improvise and innovate. And the first one you may find surprising, and it was really pointed out to me by Chinese colleagues who came here and visited schools, and made me realize how different it is, and the fact that their students absolutely have to be on key every second of the class time, because if the teacher calls on them, they have to answer instantly, and that the answer has to be perfect. So I've certainly been in many classrooms where the student stands up because he's called on, or she is called on. They have they don't give quite a perfect answer, so they are left standing while the teacher gets another student to respond, and if that answer is the best, really correct answer, then they can both sit down. But there's a lot of demand that the kids pay attention all the time. The parents say it's unbelievably exhausting for these children to do that. And that starts in first grade. Whereas here in the United States, they found people very relaxed. And you say, sometimes too relaxed. But in fact, there's time to think. The students don't have to give perfect answers. They're encouraged to ask questions and to try out ideas. And that is something that probably the Chinese could develop. I've tried to think about how the Chinese would be able to use some of these things. But I think just leaving time to think, to provide answers that aren't quite perfect might be a possibility. It's culturally very difficult, but in fact, there might be a window for that type of change to take place. The other thing is improvisation and what we often call innovation. But I think within our classrooms, something that we often can't see is that we have an improvisational, what I would call an improvisational style, in which we, in fact, the teacher plans a lesson, the students come in with questions and suggestions, and they interrupt the teacher with, oh, I know about that, and yesterday I did such and such. That's sort of unheard of in China. But here, it's a rather commonplace thing. The teacher has to actually innovate and respond to what the students are saying and develop those concepts into something that's connected to the lesson and the material that the teacher is trying to put forth. Also, there are a lot of collaborative answers in our classrooms, and so a student will start an idea and the teacher will say, is this something that you can you add to this, can you add to that, so that there become collective responses. And the other thing is that experiences are brought into the classroom. Now again, I sort of said, now how on earth can the Chinese deal with this within their traditional system? And I think one thing is encouraging students to ask questions, not the kind of questions that are asked here, but questions that might begin to break down that thing that they can't ask any questions. In all the classrooms I've been in, I've heard 2 questions asked, and one was by a student who's now studying in the United States because his parents felt he wasn't going to make it in the Chinese schools. But there are things that they can do. The other thing is that they can begin to have more experiences brought into the classroom and learn how to use those. But it's easy for me to say this is how China can change when we, in fact, can't change a lot of things ourselves. So it's a challenge to all of us, and I think we have a lot to learn from each other, but it also, in the process, raises an enormous number of other questions about how that happens and gets sustained and becomes a positive change, if it becomes a change at all. So, thank you very much.
Thanks again for the invitation. Thanks, Tom. School of Education. I'm just going to jump right into it. And I titled this talk Good News from Latin America because actually most of the news from Latin America are not very good news, especially lately. But I think I wanted to take the opportunity and the time allotted to me to talk about 3 things. I wanted, first of all, to talk about a success story from Latin America, from the region as a whole, and tell you a little bit about the reasons that explain that success. Second, I want to talk about some structural issues that may be threatening that progress, maybe slowing it down. And then finally, I'm going to give you 3 examples of policy actions that try to tackle those issues. So hopefully, I'll stay within my 15 minutes. Okay, well, we heard about China. Chinese do really well. They're growing like crazy. They have a strong economy. Latin America, not so much. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. 25% in the region live with under $4 a day. That's one of the international definitions of poverty. And in some countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, that more than half of the population lives with under $4 a day. It's also a region that doesn't do particularly well in educational outcomes. Not a lot of people graduate from high school. Not a lot of people go to college. There's a lot of social exclusion among certain populations, like indigenous populations. You're talking low single digits, 1%, 2% in terms of college going. So what could the US possibly learn about Latin America? And I actually thought a lot about this question because it's not an easy question to answer. Well, guess what? That great inequality, it's coming through a theater near you here in the United States. That is, kind of exaggerating a little bit here, but this is a chart of real household income in the US from the 1965 to 2010. And as you can see, if you're in the top 5%, which is that black line, you're really, really happy. If you're in the bottom quintile, that green line, you've seen basically no growth in your real household income. And the gap is just widening and getting, bigger and bigger and bigger. So what can a country that's becoming increasingly unequal like the United States, if maybe we pose the question that way, learn from the most unequal region in the world? It can learn that there are actually some solutions to that inequality. And this is the progress piece of the talk. That's poverty and inequality in Latin America since 1996. So in 20 years, basically, poverty fell by a lot, and so did inequality. It didn't happen across the board. There were some countries that are getting poorer. Venezuela is one of them, for example. Haiti hasn't made a lot of progress, but in many countries like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Brazil, they're not doing great, but they are doing a lot better than they were doing before. So how did these countries do it? Well, one key driver is just good old economic growth. And actually a lot of young people. They had a very young population, and economic growth really fueled employment. So nearly half of the decrease can just be explained by the rise in employment. People were getting better jobs, and the differential between those lower skilled people and college educated people narrowed. So that made it more equal. That's the college premium. In the US, actually, the college premium is widening. So if you don't have a college education, you're probably not going to make it to those to those top lines there. Now, the reason that that more people went into the labor market and they started earning better wages actually had to do with the fact that they had more education. A lot of these countries were very successful in increasing access to basic education. So a lot more students in the region now have primary education and secondary school, which is middle school and high school. And to expand schooling, countries did kind of common sense things. They spent more money, they funneled a lot more resources at the local level, so actually at the school level. They also invested in school construction. If you want to increase access, probably it's a good idea to have more spaces where people can go to. And they also invested in alternative arrangements. So for example, there was just an article published on IPA, I think in the last issue, about a system in Honduras called Sistema Aprendizaje Tutorial, where you deliver middle school, which is always really hard to go to the rural areas and invest in big middle schools there. So they have these very nimble programs where, similar, I think, to the Indian experience, where you have tutors. It's like an NGO managed situation, and they're able to very flexibly provide instruction to a lot more children. And they also started offering a lot more bilingual education for indigenous children. And a lot of research has shown that having a bilingual Spanish indigenous language school does increase access. Now, a second driver of this sort of successful poverty reduction story has to do with increased social spending. And one of the biggest policies, the most successful policies in Latin America in the past 10 years have been conditional cash transfers. These are basically cash that goes from the government directly to the families, conditional on the kids staying in school and them accessing preventive health services. This, by the way, has been tried in the US. New York City had an opportunity program. It's kind of funny because in Mexico it's called Oportunidades, so they took the program and the name, and they have been very, very successful. Now, unfortunately, lately, the reduction in inequality has slowed down. It hasn't been as sharp as before. And learning levels still remain unacceptably low. Very few students at the top of all those international test score distributions, and many, many students at the bottom. So why are children learning so little? Again, another one of these questions that's just, I think, everyone's struggling with, even in developed countries. And one of the reasons might be that access, improving educational access, might be easier to achieve than actually raising quality. So raising quality seems to be a thorny issue. So the region or policymakers in the region are kind of thinking, are there structural issues? What's holding us back, right? And one of the reasons that they give is early childhood preparation, basically. Children entering school already behind. Now, there's a lot of research from the US suggesting that kids from the bottom quartiles of the income distribution come to, enter kindergarten already with very low levels in some of these proficiency or cognitive development scales. And similar patterns have been found in Latin America. Another kind of structural issue is that schools are not becoming vehicles for social mobility. And the reason is that many of them are just, even though they've funneled more resources into them, there's still more that needs to be done. And social exclusion, particularly in higher education, which in Latin America, as in the US, is the way, it's really the ticket to social mobility, is still excluding a lot of people. So let me talk to you about these 3 successful actions that have been taken in the region to tackle some of these issues. And I also didn't call them lessons. I call them successful actions. I think, yeah, that sounds super dry. I actually like your observations a lot better. But these are some successful policies and innovations. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from actually 4 very different countries. We're going to start with Jamaica, Mexico, and El Salvador, and then I'm going to talk about Colombia. And these examples show some promising results. They've all been, in the case of the programs, they've been rigorously evaluated, so there is some evidence to suggest that they are actually working and contributing to lowering inequality and raising educational quality in the region. So let's start with Jamaica. Jamaica, internationally, is like the poster child for successful early childhood interventions. And the reason is that they've been doing these amazingly well-designed early childhood interventions that have been set up in a way that can be studied for many, many years. So in the 1980s, Jamaica started a large-scale nutritional and stimulation program for stunted children. So stunting is a very big problem in Latin America. In Guatemala, over half of the children are stunted, and if you don't grow enough by the time you're 5 or 7, it has a lot of, there's just a lot of problems associated with that. So this intervention consisted of 2 pounds of milk-based formula, that was the nutritional component, and then the stimulation component was a 1-hour home visit. Not by a super certified social worker, because a lot of these interventions, like Amita mentioned, they're not super well funded, but it was a community health worker that was trained to come to the home and give parents advice about how to make up their own toys and how to play with their kids. So this program was followed. The children in this program were randomly assigned to 3 treatment, the kids who got just the milk, the kids who got just the stimulation, and the kids who got both, and then a control group. And they followed them for up to 20 years, actually. And 2 years after the program, they saw very positive effects on child development for all groups that had gotten some sort of intervention. By ages 11 and 12, the nutritional component effect had disappeared. So the kids that just got the milk, they weren't seeing any difference with the control group. But those that received the stimulation showed greater cognitive development across all domains. And at ages 17 and 18, remember, these are 9-month-olds. So at ages 18, cognitive benefits of receiving that stimulation plus the nutrition component were still evident. So sometimes in the United States, you have these very, these controversies around early childhood because some of the experiments have very small samples or, they're designed in such a way. Well, Jamaica, it's like one data point that shows how effective these combined interventions can be. All right, let's now turn to a second type of program. This tries to tackle the issue of under-resourced schools by using local control funding and site-based management, which, as I told the students that I met with earlier today, sounds a lot like the local control funding formula in California. So this has been tried already, been there, done that, in El Salvador for over 10 years. With the EDUCO program. The EDUCO program was a way, again, to expand access to education. The Ministry of Education basically transferred the money into an account that was completely managed by the school. The principal was able to, and the school council, they were able to hire and fire teachers, lots of autonomy. And the program helped kids stay in school longer. It increased community involvement, and it produced actually better classroom environments. Mexico has had a similar program also for about 10 years. Modest results in terms of test scores, but you could see that the money was funneled into the school, the community monitored the use of those funds, and ultimately it proved to be highly effective. And last, let me turn to an intervention from Colombia. This is actually more at the national level, and it was about college exit exams and how to develop better labor market systems. better labor market signals. So in Colombian higher education, there's significant sorting by socioeconomic status. So the higher kind of high reputation colleges concentrated a lot of students from higher socioeconomic status, and the lower reputation colleges had students from lower socioeconomic status. However, the researchers found that even if you kept student ability constant, higher SES, this sorting still was taking place. So imagine this. In Colombia, they have an SAT-like test called the ICFES. Tom, I'm sure, is well aware of it, that every high school student needs to take. So this is not a voluntary thing. You have to take it. Otherwise, you don't graduate. And in most colleges, the ICFES is the sole criterion for entry into college. That's it. They don't look at your essay. They don't look at whether you did band or, do a school play, whatever, just your ICFES. So you would think that this would be a highly meritocratic system, right? Because if it's only based on your test score, then whoever gets the higher test score is going to go to highly ranked schools. I just want you to focus on the right-hand side of this graph. This shows the ICFES score and then the college reputation. And if you look at the black bar, you will see that this is by mother's education. So kids whose mothers only had no education, right? I mean, they're evidently first-generation students. Even the kids that were scoring really high on that ICFES test were not going to schools. I mean, they could have gone to much higher-ranked schools, but they were not going. Maybe because they kind of didn't feel like they would belong there, or they couldn't pay the tuition. I mean, there could be all sorts of constraints. So what Colombia did is, I mean, this was then a big problem because you're a really, smart student. You're like in the 99th percentile, but you're going to a lower-ranked college, and so when they're hiring you, your employer's looking at your college diploma, and you're earning less, basically, than the kids that went to those super highly reputed schools. Did I do this right? Okay, so what Colombia did is introduced a central exit exam. So everybody who graduated from college, doesn't matter where you went to, had to take an exit exam. And people put their scores on this exam on their CV. So what this ended up doing is that it actually, the sorting really reduced the sorting, and it really increased the earnings of people that had gone to lower reputation colleges, because now an employer had better signals. So instead of saying, oh, you come from this, not so great school, oh my God, but your scores are really, really high, so come for an interview. So that's an example of a nationwide policy that really fixed an issue in terms of the information and the signaling. All right, so in some policies that are explicitly targeted to decrease inequality can actually work, if they're well-designed and if they tackle structural issues behind this inequality. The experience from the regional social policy documents this progress. And the good news for all of us in this room, and the reason why we're all here every day, and you guys are getting trained, and we are doing research and trying to teach you, is because we believe at the end of the day that education policy can be an effective way to reduce inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, that was amazing. So I learned a lesson this evening, and that's not to ask people to draw lessons for the United States. They're going to change your terminology somewhere or another, but those observations, shall we call them, were really amazing, and so I want to thank all of our speakers once again. Thank you. I have a few questions that I'm going to ask our speakers, and then I would encourage all of you to participate in the conversation. So if you fight your way down to these reserved seats down here, what we're actually going to do in terms of asking questions is we're going to have those who want to ask questions come down and sit in these seats, and then you're actually going to come up to the podium, because we don't have one of those mics that travels around. So while I'm asking a couple questions, think about whether you would like to ask a question, and if so, you can come on down here and start to queue up. But hurry before the spaces fill up. All right, so I was really heartened to hear good news from Latin America, also good news from South Asia, and good news from China and from the United States, to hear some promising things about education in the United States. So one of the pieces of good news that I heard about in Amita's presentation, and I think that we kind of can infer it from the other two, was this deep belief in the transformative value of education. So the belief that education is both a right and a privilege, and that it, in this survey of South Asian respondents, it was deemed the top priority for every demographic group across age populations in South Asia. And I think we also see some of this belief in the transformative power of education in the examples that Nancy gave in terms of the just really phenomenally hard work that children and their teachers put into to learning in China. And I think we also see this belief in the power of education through Lucrecia's examples of the increasing enrollments in education, increasing access and enrollments in education when we give children opportunities through things like conditional cash transfers. So I can't wait for this question. So here's my question. So thinking about this belief in the transformative value of education that I think we see evidence of in all of the regions we've discussed this evening, what do you think is behind this belief, this seemingly untiring belief that education can empower us and make our lives richer and lead us to live just overall better lives? And so first, what is behind this? Because there are various perspectives you could take on this question. What underlies this belief in the power of education? And second, how do you think this translates to the U.S. context? In other words, do you see the same belief in the power of education? Does it look different, or is this a universal phenomenon? So I will allow anyone who's interested in answering this question to take a stab at it. Nancy?
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this one is a slightly easy. This one's a slightly easy one for China because, in fact, the drive for education goes back thousands of years. And so, so it's embedded in the Chinese, sort of in the DNA almost, for centuries. Back actually long before Confucius, there were educational academies in which mathematics were taught, also warfare, but other elements of education that were deemed very important, and that is gradually transferred. And then after Confucius, actually many hundreds of years afterwards, his analects and his books became part of the national exam. And that became very problematic because, in fact, you had to memorize all of those books in order to pass for the civil service exam. But at the same time, it embedded in the country, which has different configurations over history, this sense that education is extremely important, and Confucius actually has had a big influence on it, sometimes for worse because of the type of education he was talking about. But at the same time, this drive, the education, and to become a moral person, and they're connected in China, are extremely important. And so respect for education is sort of embedded in everyone's belief in what should happen. So it's one of the most important values, and it is an educated person's aim, from the philosophical terms, is to become a moral person, not just an individual with a lot of learning, but actually a moral and better person. So that sort of, I think, addresses your
Yes,
question.
very much. Thank you.
Just wanted to add that I think at least in Latin America, what underlies this belief is that people kind of do see that it is, unless you win the lottery or like your tío becomes the local mayor and like gives you a job, it is really your only way out in many circumstances from a lot of hardship. I also wanted to emphasize that it is also a fragile concept, right? Because if people start seeing, if they start become disenchanted with this transformative ideal, if they see that it doesn't lead anywhere, it doesn't get you a good job, it doesn't, it doesn't put you out of poverty, it can also, I think that's a real enemy, for a school system, for a country. When that starts to happen, a lot of bad things follow.
All right. My next question is about the spread of educational innovations and ideas. So we can think of plenty of examples of educational innovation and policy and ideas spreading from the north to the south. And there are increasing examples. Amita gave a couple of increasing south-south transfer of ideas and south-south cooperation in education. So I can only think of one example of south to north spread of educational innovation and policy, and that was the one that Lucrecia described, the Opportunity NYC Conditional Cash Transfer Program in New York City, which was modeled after the program in Mexico, Oportunidades. So I'm curious in your work if you're familiar with any other examples of south to north transfer or spread of innovation in education, or east to south, and what is that example and how was it able to take hold? Amita.
Well, one example I know of south to north transfer is what Tom is doing right now here, and I actually would like to give a round of applause to Tom for, which.
Thank you.
And I would hope and I would imagine that this is also what takes hold. This very effort to do exactly this, to think of this, to put this panel together. And I know that this is something Tom has been thinking about for quite a while. So this isn't it. How about that? How is that for an answer? Right?
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Yes, no, absolutely. And this effort that Tom is engaged in, and I wish him all the success. And as I said, I look forward to continue working together. But it's this inviting us to think about the question in this perspective. I think it's just wonderful. So that's an example.
Thank you. Great example.
Go ahead.
No, I was just, Paulo Freire has had a slight influence,
that's a good point,
I would
yeah.
say.
I think one potential south-north transfer that isn't quite happening, I think, at the level I think it should be happening, but is on teacher training in bilingual programs, for example. You have a neighboring country that speaks Spanish and trains its teachers, maybe doesn't train them all, as well as it should, but a lot of teachers are very well trained. And you have a big growing population here that could benefit from bilingual instruction. I think just having that sharing of just how to teach Spanish, which is not something necessarily teachers learn here, would be an incredible exchange. And it's just like right there, right? But it's other things get in the way of oftentimes of those exchanges.
Great. Well, I see a couple of people over here who would like to ask questions, and I encourage anyone else who's interested in asking a question to make their way down. But let me open up the podium to Yvonne. And please introduce yourself when you come ask a question.
Good night, everyone. My name is Yvonne, and I'm a graduate student, and of course, a student of Dr. L. I want to thank, sorry for the cold too, I want to thank the panelists for being here and sharing all this information. And I'm so happy that I took this class because, America is built on immigrants, right? And I think that maybe the love of trying to find out what's happening in the global economy is the fact that we came from somewhere different and we're here now. and we love education. I'm from Belize. And so I was waiting to hear from the Caribbean if you were going to say anything about Belize, but you got us close to Jamaica. But I still wanted to see if you've done anything in Belize, and I'll ask you that particularly. But you know, I've seen the school coming to kids on the boat. I want to know, was that a native person idea, or was that funded? Because I think it's a great way of overcoming obstacles. The China example is showing how our instructional styles are different, and yet, you know, they're accomplishing some things that we're not. And of course, with Latin America, because Belize is part of that too. As we move into Common Core, okay, and with you guys, you've shown how basic education can be, and how some parts of the world it's really, really basic. And here in America, we're moving into Common Core and critical thinking. When you think about what the agenda should be for the rest of the world as compared to America, where are they in terms of, are we stretching it? Is it a moderate expectation? Can you just talk about that for me, based on where the people are working at, what they're working with, and how far we think as Americans we are?
All right, there was a couple of things that you mentioned there, Ivan. And just with the boat example, which I think is pretty cool as well, here's what I know about it. So that's just a specific piece. It was actually identified also, I want to say, in the Wise Prize, like one of the runner-ups and so forth. So that's sort of, you know, I think it was identified like that. I think the man who thought of this idea was a local Bangladeshi man who was an architect, and he came up with this idea. So it was a local idea, and now it has been recognized internationally. So they might be receiving some international funds, but I think it was a local indigenous solution. And in speaking in terms of sort of where is the rest of the world vis-a-vis the United States, I think that question, I'm more qualified to speak about where the developing world is. I'm not sort of an expert on, say, Finland or Norway or Singapore, some of these more developed systems. But for a lot of the poor countries, Common Core is a discussion that in some sense is quite far away. I mean, they have their systems which are often very centralized, but in many poor countries, like you heard, Lucrecia mention, and I spoke a little bit about this. I mean, there has been a fair bit of success in getting children into school, but it's a real challenge to ensure that the children have some basic reading, writing, learning ability. I mean, very, very few percent of children really perform at any reasonable proficiency level in so many of these countries, that the problems are really, in some sense, what might call a first-order problem, is simply getting the basics of education right. So in some sense, the discussion that is happening in the United States is quite a bit ahead of that conversation, and because this country is ahead, for obvious reasons. So that's my sense of that.
I just wanted to add that unfortunately, I haven't come across a lot of research on Belize. So maybe, Yvonne, maybe you can start generating some of that. Yeah.
Right. Let me just add one thing about the poor areas of China, of which I haven't talked, and there are many poor areas of China. And some of the outlying areas, I can't think of many things from the United States that could possibly be helpful in those areas. I think experiences from other countries that are more in the same area of challenge are much better suited to that. The only thing I can think of here that might help in those poor areas, but is really hard governmentally to institute, is bilingual education. In the minority areas, China is about 90% or more Han, which is the major culture. They're the ones who speak Putonghua, which we call Mandarin. And then there are these many minority groups, and we hear about, of course, Tibet and the Uyghurs in the western part, but there are many others too who have native languages that are not common, and although there have been bilingual attempts, usually from outside, like the British Council, it hasn't gone very far. And there are some very interesting studies coming out of Hong Kong, and I'm not sure how complete they are yet, looking at some of those communities and how to help them. But I think that's maybe one area of expertise that might be transferable in a very careful way.
So this might be a record for the youngest participant in one of these lecture series. Linda Lushai. Oh, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Linda Lushai. I'm 10 years old, and I have a question for each of these people. Amita, on the boats, the school boats, as you say, how do they provide the money to get the solar panels?
Oh, that's a wait.
Here.
Now I think I got it.
Oh, you got
This
it.
works, yeah? I, Linda, don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know. I mean, that's sort of a cop-out, but, I actually genuinely don't know. And I think as I was looking this up, I mean, this is not, it's not like I've done any personal research on these school boats, but I think they did explain how they were trying to use this as a mode of income generation for these communities as well. Because, I mean, if you have solar panels and you have electricity, and many of these areas, if it is so hard to even simply get to school, not surprising that they maybe don't even have the basics of the day-to-day. So that is the sense I have, that they had a conscious eye towards using the solar panels themselves as a way of income generation. So, and Bangladesh, by the way, you must know BRAC, the NGO that I mentioned a bit and Tom mentioned, whose founder won the first Weiss Award, the Weiss Prize. Mohammed Yunus, I mean, BRAC, one of the biggest innovations it's known for is microfinance, right? Which is working with providing financial help to groups of women and small financial help to make them independent and financially sustainable. So with that background in Bangladesh, I won't be surprised if there is some solution like that. But a good question. Thank you for thinking about it.
Okay, Nancy, I've got a question for you too. When the teachers are teaching, do they do it by courses or lessons, or what strategy?
You mean subjects?
Yeah.
By subjects?
Yeah.
The teachers actually they teach only their own subject area. So they would teach mathematics. So for first grade, they would teach mathematics that's appropriate for first grade, second grade, third grade. And so every time they come into the classroom, they sort of adjust they have a separate lesson for that grade level. And so the Chinese teachers, which is like teaching reading and writing here, teach, they have lessons that are subject-oriented, but they're based on what's in the textbook. So the textbook has lesson 25, they come in and they teach lesson 25, and if you go to different parts of the country, they're teaching lesson 25 in a lot of parts of the country, so it's fairly coordinated. There is a national curriculum. Does that answer your question or not? Maybe. Half. Okay, what didn't I answer?
It was good.
Oh, well, afterward, if you think of some way to ask me, let me know, okay?
Okay.
Probably didn't get that in China, Nancy.
Not at all.
Okay. What was my question? Oh, yeah. I forgot my question for some reason.
You have a question for Lucrecia?
Yeah, but I forgot it.
Well, maybe you can think about it and come back. And
Oh, yeah.
about Mexico, maybe?
I remembered it.
Good.
So the schools, how, they're different, I don't know how to explain it, but, the ones who are, more of kind of rich have more, quality.
Uh-huh.
And the ones who are, medium are, good. And how does the process work?
How do some schools get so good and some schools not so much?
Yeah.
Well, part of the process, I think, just has to do with the kind of resources they can get. And by resources, I mean the kind of teachers they're able to hire. A lot of the richer schools are just nicer working environments for a lot of teachers. And they provide more opportunities for the kids. So it's like a cycle, right? Because the richer kids kind of want to live closer to those schools. They're able to live closer to the schools so they can go. And then they're also accessing better resources. So it just kind of feeds on itself. And exactly the opposite happens with the poorer schools.
That answered my question.
Thank you. I passed the test.
Great question. Charlena.
Hi, thank you again for being here and for everything that you shared. So I'm actually really excited about this topic, especially right now, because Indonesia just had we just have a new education minister that just started late last year, and he's actually also the founder of Teach for Indonesia, which is kind of like a model for Teach for America. So he's a very popular and very charismatic leader, and I think he's going to do a lot of great things in Indonesia. And recently in December, he actually announced that the education system in Indonesia is in a state of emergency. And I'm not excited about that, but I'm excited by the fact that it's a public acknowledgement for the very first time probably that our national education system basically needs an overhaul and needs major revisions and reconstruction. So I was just wondering, based on, this might be a loaded question, but based on all of your experience and knowledge and all the educational innovations that you've come across in the South and all your travels, I wonder if you have any maybe any ideas or suggestions or recommendations for a country like Indonesia with our unique size and diversity and setting and everything. If you have any recommendations or just thoughts in general, and also if you have any thoughts for an early researcher such as myself as to like what would be a good area to pursue and look into in terms of policy and research. Thank you.
I think the thing that is so distinct about Indonesia is not only is it so large in terms of the population, but the geography is so unique, right, of the country in terms of the, like 18,000 islands or 16, right? I mean, it's pretty incredible. So, I think one of the things that it's like a lesson. I think it's just such a big word, but and it's not that I'm by any means an expert in Indonesia, but one of the things that if I were to note in a country such as India or say Pakistan, which are also large, diverse, with maybe a population profile that is not entirely dissimilar, it seems to be the role of civil society, right? The role of non-government organizations. I mean, the work that these NGOs, non-government organizations, have been able to do is pretty incredible. Now, I don't know how one sustains such a movement across Indonesia, which is geographically also so disparate. But it seems to me that there is really a lot of power to be drawn from these kinds of civil society movements, where it is people like you and I, in some sense, right, who are coming together and are willing to work across the country. Rather than relying simply on the government to come and tell us what to do, we step up our game and step in as well. So that would be. Sort of and I mean, as an early researcher and early scholar, I think there are so many different. Tom, here you have a wonderful resource in Tom Lucia himself, who's done so much work on Indonesia. I, for example, am aware through some of the students I work with, and we talked briefly about this, that Indonesia has done this tremendous teacher reform. Where every teacher has now this 4-year training or something like that. I mean, these are huge financial investments, right, for a country such as Indonesia. I mean, a country which is so big, with such a large teacher labor force. And so I think that alone might be a very productive and interesting area of policy-focused research in the next several years, right? Like, what happens to this investment? Does it lead to positive outcomes? What do the teachers think about it? Because it's a huge commitment that the nation has made, and this is a ripe time to study aspects of it. So that comes to my mind as potentially particularly an interesting area of research right now in the in the country. And then the second related thought would be any kind of sort of learning outcome, because focus on learning, Lucrecia mentioned that once you fix the access issue, getting the quality right is such a challenge. And Indonesia does participate in TIMSS, the International Math and Science Study, so you have national level data set in at least in 8th grade for Indonesia. And so that's another, I think, fruitful venue to pursue potentially.
It's kind of hard to think about a whole country and, as Amita said, kind of see how to fix it, right? Every country struggles with that. Even Finland, they didn't do that well in the last PISA, and they're like, oh my God, maybe we need to change everything now. But I do think that one of the things that all developing countries should do, all countries in general, but in developing countries it just makes such a huge difference, is just encourage and support more people to get training, such as yourselves, right? People that can study the issues there, that can really spend a lot of time trying to figure out what to do and can bring back ideas and can really help think through programs. And one of the fascinating things about doing international research, independent of whether you're from the country or not, is just the amount of impact that you can have. Here in the United States, there's so many of us working on same issues that if you move, policy like 1 millimeter, sorry, I've been in this country for many years, I still do not know the US system of measures. But even you move it just a little bit, it's a lot of work. In Mexico, for example, when I did my dissertation using Carrera Magistral, which was a teacher incentive program, 2 years later, after I got that published, the minister, well, not him, but like his office called and asked me to write some suggested, and it ended up, becoming part of the reform. That would never, ever happen to me here. Just because, first of all, there's not like a minister that's going to call you and then it's going to change everything for the country. But in developing countries, you are one of a handful, really. And I think that's a source of should be a source of a lot of commitment, to the country. So I think just the fact that you guys are here and you're studying Indonesia bodes very well for Indonesia.
So I'd just like to chime in really quickly to second Amita's observation about Indonesia's participation in TIMSS, but also I think in Pearls and PISA as well. There are a lot of data out there about Indonesia, and I haven't seen a lot of people publishing with those data, but there's a lot of very rich information that I think is, for the most part, untapped. Dickie, speaking of Indonesia.
Thank you for amazing presentation of all of you. I have a question for Dr. Santibanez about what happened in Colombia, the central exit exam. Could you elaborate if, you know that in every country there is what we call Ivy League university, so I guess maybe some of the graduate of the Ivy League will have some advantage compared to other universities. So how can it equalize the result? Yeah. And
yeah.
This, oh yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, this research was actually performed by a colleague of mine, Juan Saavedra, and other people. Juan is over at USC. We should bring him once to present because it's really interesting work. Colombia is a highly, it's a country where a lot of tests happen. They don't have censal standardized exams as we do here, but they have a lot of sample-based tests like NAEP, for example, and they have this ICFES test, which every high school graduate takes, and entrance into universities is meritocratic to the point, that it's not completely meritocratic because by the time you get to the ICFES stage, there's already a lot of kind of segregation happening in terms of where you're able to go to school. This ECAES, which is the name of the test, was recently implemented. I can share the paper with you. I don't know the exact year that it was, but it was implemented. It's basically a test. It's by subject area. So it was initially implemented just in a few fields. I believe it was like accounting and business administration and a few others, and they gradually expanded it to include all fields. So it's basically a standardized test. given by the same agency that gives out NAEP, the Colombian NAEP. And everyone takes it, and it's just, I don't think they intended it to become a labor market signal. I think they intended it so it could bring some accountability to higher education in terms of maybe some private institutions or some lesser, like less good public institutions could be held accountable because they could benchmark each other. But it ended up working as a very effective labor market signal, because if you go to the top university, well, that's another thing. But in the middle, there are a lot of universities that people are less certain about their quality. So this exam helped with that. But I can share the paper with you. It has all the details there about what exactly they did. But it's been very successful in eliminating some of that social background influence on how you perform in the labor market.
Thank you. And I have another question for Dr. Chudgar about not about the Bollywood, but I like the, I'm interested in some innovation is everywhere, including in developing countries like in India or Indonesia, but not all innovation can be implemented in a widespread implement. So do you have any suggestion for developing countries, not for developed countries, not for the US, but for developing countries, how an innovation like that? And I also borrow a question from this afternoon from Tammy, that some teachers who have training from a developing country in the US, and they said that I cannot do this in our country like that. So it is like, so what is your suggestion for make an innovation widespread in developing countries?
Well, if it's not Bollywood, I don't know, because that's what I specialize in. So, a very good question, Nikki. But I think what we saw examples of here, I often wonder this, right? I mean, I'm a professor, I sit in a university, I write papers. I don't go in the field doing some of this work, and I often wonder if, I have such admiration for my colleagues who are working in the field, who are actually making sort of the day-to-day, right? I mean, which is very different than the work that I get to do, which I really enjoy and love. But so from a distance, if I watch them work and if I can learn something from them, it seems that there is potentially tremendous power to this, this idea of the South-South transfer. Tom mentioned earlier today that BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, coming together, setting up their own development bank, and the potential we might have when we come together as southern countries and commit ourselves to sharing knowledge, sharing information. I mean, I must say it is heartening for me that India and Pakistan are collaborating on this. And on this, I mean, these countries don't, as you know, don't necessarily get along on so many issues. But when it comes to working on education for children, it's lovely that there is that regional collaboration. And actually, these countries have so much in common. Even the word ASAR, which is the acronym for the program, the word has the same meaning in Hindi and in Urdu, which are the languages of India and Pakistan. And that, I mean, so to me, that is, I think, where the South-South collaboration might be the hope to spread some of these innovations and take them to scale. So that's just a thought.
So hello, my name is Michelle, first year PhD student. So I have a multifaceted question. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to narrow it down to 3. Just 3. So we spoke a lot about innovations that occur on the local and national level within respective countries, and how innovations are important because undoubtedly exemplifies within these communities that there's an interest and a need for education. So I have a 3-part question. Well, they're actually separate questions. So my first question is that when you see an innovative program that happens on a local level, have there been any examples where government actually adopts those local innovations and scales up? And what examples have that been, and are they successful? And the second question that I have is, how are they sustained? So a lot of things that happen, especially in, I'm just speaking from my understanding of El Salvador in Latin America, is that they have wonderful innovative ideas. However, it's very difficult for the government to sustain these programs and them last longer than 4 years, as just exaggeration. And then my third question is that aside from creating these innovations, having these innovations, sustaining these innovations on a more macro level, we talked a lot about like systemic issues that impact education, inequality across socioeconomic status between different groups. So what system factors contribute to this education inequality? And do you think, or what is your opinion, do you think centralized or decentralized education systems within governments have some type of contribution to such inequalities? And if so, could you elaborate and kind of explain your thinking on that?
But I guess I'll speak to, each of these just very, very briefly. In terms of examples of the government adopting or trying to take some of these things to scale, it actually, ASER, for example, one of the things that you see, the successful examples of, say, actually, and I know less about BRAC, but I know more about Pratham, they are NGOs, they are civil society groups, but they very much work keeping the government together. They don't alienate the government. Every year when they release the reports, which basically show that the children in India are not learning very much, it is the government minister who inaugurates the report sort of in New Delhi, right? So there is really this effort to keep the government together. And the government then does sit up and take notice, right? Because how can it not? Because the idea is here that we are all committed to the same goal. And I think this is something that you do see happening, in how these good groups are able to, because they understand that ultimately to really make change happen, you can't just be working as an NGO and make everything happen. You need that collaborative partnerships and so forth. And I think that also speaks to the issue of sustainability of these reforms. That's a very, very pertinent question. And my observation would be that it is that commitment to stay for the long haul, right? The folks who are doing this ASER survey for the last 10 years, it's often a thankless job, right, year after year, but you do it because you believe in that big cause. And so sustainability comes from these kinds of commitments, which is in some sense sort of not a maybe fully satisfying answer, but there is a thought. And to the issue of centralization versus decentralization, I think that's a very good question too. Tom and I have actually, when we worked on teacher distribution issues, and this is something that I know Tom has spent a fair bit of time thinking about as well, that whether systems which are centralized and can work as a unit more coherently, can they maybe lead to more equitable distribution of resources? Because I'm sitting in the central office, I know that there's a poor region, I'll send you there, versus having a rich state and a poor state sort of kind of having very, very different outcomes. And I think what one might say that, and I know Tom has done some of this work as well, is that if it is a system that is centralized but also committed to the notions of equity, then perhaps that is the best thing that a nation can hope for, that the government is able to control sort of resource allocation across the country in a systematic manner, have the big picture view, but also is committed to equity, right? Because if the commitment to equity is not there, then you can have the centralization, but that doesn't necessarily make it a fair system. So, and Tom and I worked on a paper that, Tom took the lead on, where we compared the education systems in South Korea and Mexico, and kind of made this very similar arguments about the role of centralization, decentralization, and the focus on equity versus not, and how that can play out. So those are some of the thoughts to your three questions. But yeah.
Right. Yes, there are a lot of complex issues wandering around in those questions. In China, actually, you don't see a lot of innovation, or I don't see a lot of innovation, and I do try to go to a lot of schools. I do not go to what are called the key schools, which are funded by the government and have a lot of money poured into them, because I'm more interested in the more average schools. And I'm not sure there's a lot of innovation in those key schools, because in fact they're really aimed at passing that exam, period. But I have seen innovation in some schools in which there are collaborators from other countries. So I was in a school rather recently in Hefei, which is in a rather poor, in fact, one of the poorest provinces in China. And they collaborate with East China Normal University, which collaborates with people primarily in the United States. And the school was actually trying, for the first time, to involve parents, which is very unusual. Chinese parents and the school system are this far away. The parents basically listen to what the teachers have to say about their kids, and they don't ever respond back. There's no parents don't go into the schools except for performances or something like that. There's a real separation. And in this school, the school was actually trying to involve the parents and create what they called, in English, a PTA. And to have them, they actually, when I saw them, they were talking not only about some of the problems in the school, but also they were critiquing the lesson of a beginning teacher, which she had done as a demonstration lesson, but she was there and they were saying what they thought was useful. They asked questions, et cetera, as a way to try to involve them in the process. They evidently were also communicating with these parents and trying to have them interact with other parents and calm down some of the issues. Like the school had just gone to school uniforms, and there was a lot of hostility from the parents about it. And so they were sort of talking with these parents and having the parents sort of talk within the communities about the issues and what the problems were. Where that goes is always hard to know, but China evolves in a way that, because I'm an outsider, it's every time I go, I learn how much I don't know. But in fact, the change comes in a way that's not very comprehensible to Westerners. And in fact, that there is this tremendously centralized government, and at the same time, it's becoming, in education, less and less centralized, which brings up all sorts of other problems, some positive and some not. But when you see an innovation like this, and whether or not, I know it will spread from school to school that these people from Nanjing, East China Normal University work with. But in fact, where it will go from there is hard to say, except that there are these private schools that have grown up and are becoming an area for innovation, and it's just very hard to know whether they will become fully accredited schools within the system or whether they'll die. My guess is, because there's so much pressure, they will eventually in some way become part of the system. But the centralization, decentralization in a pretty authoritarian country is interesting to watch. And one of the problems with decentralization is that corruption really gets into the system in a different way than it does in the national system. So that's enough. It's a very complicated question to deal with. Great.
I'm Tammy, and I'm a third-year student here. And my life, I'm not that old, but I've always worked with language learners, and depending on the different populations I've worked with, when I've advocated for them, sometimes because I like the term you use, European American, because I don't like being called white. Sometimes I get pushback because I'm an outsider. I don't know where the students are coming from. From your experiences, can you tell me, as being an outsider, trying to advocate for someone within the community, what can I do, or what can we do in order to advocate for English language learners in the United States, and what advice would you have for me?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. I think that's a great question, because it's definitely a concern of many researchers. I once had a researcher, a European American researcher from UC Riverside that was doing a lot of studies about undocumented students and immigration, come to me and actually say, can I even do this, right? Are people gonna believe me? I think that people learn to recognize passion and commitment. They definitely also learn to recognize good research and good contributions. I think that's first and foremost what matters most. I think you have a tremendous advantage, because as an American, you're also able to navigate this environment, and you're able to use the language that's going to be persuasive in this environment, right? I actually feel sometimes people in the US, will have an easier time connecting with somebody that kind of speaks the same language. So I hope you don't worry too much about that. I understand why you're worrying about. I think we all worry about that from our own trenches, right? In terms of, am I able to say, I would go to school districts and study school leaders, never having studied in an American school. So I was had the same concern. Are they going to believe what I'm saying if I've never actually sat in a U.S. school? But again, I think good research and definitely passion just speaks for itself.
Just very briefly, having been a European American in a lot of different cultures, including a bilingual teacher in Pasadena, is that I think the thing that I've learned, the one lesson I've learned, among many, and certainly Claremont helped this, and that was to always know that I'm an outsider and know that I can never actually cross that border. And in fact, John Regan was my advisor, and one thing he said that I've always kept in mind, he was talking about Chinese and the untranslatability about Chinese, but he described it as when you're working in another culture, it's like walking along the wall of a garden and not being able to look down. You can look down into it, but you can never get off the wall. And that's always been a good image for me to hang on to, because as I try to understand cultures, it's easy to try to try to go past that area that I can never cross. So.
Gosh, I don't know if I have anything, but I fully, like Lucrecia mentioned, and I'm not a European, whatever the thing is, as you can perhaps tell. But I think about this all the time too. I mean, for me, what is international work? I work on India. Is India domestic work? Because that's also my home. That's where I grew up, and so I think these questions of being inside, being on the inside, being on the outside are so persistent for all of us who now live multicultural, bicultural, cross-national lives. And to me, I think just sort of what you heard here is that one is the passion and the commitment you have, and then the other is the humbleness that, I perhaps am not going to be able to figure everything out. And that is true for anybody, really, isn't it? I mean, it's not like sometimes from the inside you can't have a clear view because you're so stuck in that. So, sometimes you have a benefit that someone on the inside doesn't have. So there's nothing, but it is what it is, right? It's owning your identity as a scholar and being at ease with it and being honest about it. That's the best you can do, right? I mean, you're not trying to pretend anything you're not. You are who you are. You know this, you don't know that. And you do the best with that. So that's how I think about it. But it's wonderful to me that you are thinking about it, right? Because if you were not, then it would be a problem. But the fact that you are, that I think is itself sort of the good news of the solution. So.
Well, I'm glad we're ending on a note of good news, because there was actually a lot of good news in this talk. And so the good news is that you can, that actually a great strategy for having a wonderful talk is to invite your graduate school buddies and your alumni to be the presenters.
Fantastic audience.
And thank you for your terrific questions. And I want to give a parting gift to all of our participants. So this is our own CGU mug, and I have one for each of our speakers this evening. Please help me once again to thank them for wonderful talks.